The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 307, casting long rectangles of light across the worn wooden floor. The room smelled like furniture polish and old books, a scent that reminded Kimberly Daniels of school libraries and her grandmother's living room. She sat in the back row, straightening the sleeve of her navy pantsuit and checking her watch for the third time in 5 minutes. She wasn't nervous exactly. 7 years with the United States Secret Service had trained that out of her, but this wasn't her usual role. Today, she wasn't here to protect anyone or investigate financial crimes. She was here for Michael, her friend since they were both kids sharing a backyard fence in their Detroit neighborhood. The courtroom was filling up slowly. A court reporter typed quietly at her station. 2 lawyers shuffled papers at separate tables, occasionally glancing at each other with the wary looks of boxers before a match. In the gallery, a handful of people sat scattered among the benches, most keeping to themselves. Kimberly noticed how different this county courthouse felt from the federal buildings where she usually worked. The paint was chipped in places. The American flag in the corner had faded from too many years of fluorescent lighting, and the clock on the wall was 3 minutes fast. But the power in this room was real, regardless of its worn edges. "All rise," called the bailiff, a heavy-set man with a thick mustache and a uniform that seemed a size too small. The Honorable Judge Richard Harmon presiding. Everyone stood as the side door opened and Judge Harmon swept in, his black robe billowing slightly. He was tall and lean, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him an intellectual air. At 62, he'd spent 30 years on the bench and carried himself with the confidence of someone who was used to having the final word. "Be seated," he said, settling into his chair and immediately opening a folder. He didn't look up as he spoke. "We're continuing with the case of State versus Johnson. Defense, I believe you have additional witnesses today?" The defense attorney stood quickly. He was young, probably not more than 3 years out of law school, with an ill-fitting suit and earnest eyes. "Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Thomas Rivera." A middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair made his way to the witness stand. He was Michael's supervisor at the warehouse where he'd worked for the past 4 years. As he was sworn in, Kimberly studied Judge Harmon's face. The judge looked bored already, flipping through papers while the witness stated his name and occupation. The testimony began, with Rivera explaining that Michael was a reliable employee who had never been late, never caused problems, and had been up for a promotion. "And on the night in question," the defense attorney asked, "did the defendant mention any plans to you?" "Yes, he told me he was heading straight home because his sister was visiting from out of town. He was excited about it, said they were going to catch up over dinner." The prosecutor stood up, a sharp-featured woman in her 40s with a reputation for being relentless. "Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay." Judge Harmon nodded. Sustained. The questioning continued, but Kimberly could see that the judge wasn't impressed. His eyes occasionally drifted to the clock, and he suppressed a yawn at one point. When the prosecutor began her cross-examination, his interest seemed to perk up slightly. "Mr. Rivera, you weren't with the defendant after he left work, were you?" "No, but so you have no first-hand knowledge of his whereabouts during the time of the robbery?" "No, but I know he wouldn't." "Just yes or no answers, please. You have no knowledge of his whereabouts, correct?" "Correct," Rivera admitted, looking defeated. Judge Harmon interrupted before the defense could begin redirect. "Unless there's something substantive to add, let's move on. The court isn't interested in character witnesses who can't speak to the facts of the case." The defense attorney looked flustered. "Your Honor, Mr. Rivera's testimony establishes the defendant's mindset and plans for the evening, which contradicts the prosecution's timeline. It establishes what the defendant told someone. That's not evidence of where he actually was," Judge Harmon replied dismissively. "Next witness, please." Rivera was excused, walking back to his seat with slumped shoulders. Kimberly felt a twinge of sympathy. She'd seen this before. How quickly someone could be diminished in a courtroom if they didn't have the right credentials or vocabulary. The next witness was a neighbor from Michael's apartment building, an elderly woman who testified that she saw him arriving home around the time the robbery was taking place across town. But under the prosecutor's questioning, She became confused about the exact timing, and Judge Harmon's impatience was visible in the tight set of his mouth. "Your Honor," he said, "I'm not sure if the witness is clear on the timeline." "Neither am I," the judge replied. "Ma'am, if you can't be certain about the time, then your testimony isn't helpful to this court." The woman looked close to tears as she stepped down. Kimberly felt her jaw tighten. This was going exactly as she'd feared. Michael's public defender was out of his depth, and the judge had seemingly made up his mind already. During a brief recess, Kimberly approached the defense table. Michael sat there, hands folded, wearing the only suit he owned, the same one he'd worn to his college graduation and his grandmother's funeral. When he saw her, his face brightened slightly. "Hey, Kim," he said quietly. "Thanks for coming." "Of course." She squeezed his shoulder. "How's it going?" Before he could answer, his lawyer turned to them, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "Not great. Judge Harmon is dismissing our witnesses before they can establish anything meaningful." "I saw," Kimberly said. "Are you still planning to call me?" The lawyer nodded. "You're next, actually, and frankly our best shot. The security footage from your building is the only solid evidence we have that places him nowhere near the robbery." Michael looked between them. "Will the judge even allow it?" "He seems to have made up his mind." "He has to allow relevant evidence," the lawyer said, though he didn't sound completely convinced. "Agent Daniels, just stick to the facts, what you saw on the footage, the timestamp verification. Don't let the prosecutor rattle you during cross." Kimberly almost smiled at that. After facing down counterfeiters and standing post during high-tension diplomatic meetings, a county prosecutor didn't intimidate her. But she understood the stakes here. This wasn't about her. It was about Michael, who was facing 5 years for a crime he didn't commit. The bailiff called the court back to order. As everyone settled in, Judge Harmon adjusted his glasses and fixed the defense attorney with an impatient stare. "Your next witness, counselor? And please, someone with relevant testimony this time." The young lawyer stood, straightening his tie. "The defense calls Special Agent Kimberly Daniels." Kimberly walked down the center aisle, feeling the eyes of the courtroom on her. She was used to blending into the background, to being the watchful presence that no one noticed until they needed to. But today she needed to be seen and heard. As she approached the witness stand, she caught the subtle shift in Judge Harmon's expression. A slight narrowing of the eyes, a quick assessment of her appearance. She was familiar with that look. At 32, standing 5'6" with her natural hair pulled back in a neat bun, she didn't match many people's mental image of a federal agent. The bailiff held out the Bible. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" "I do," Kimberly said clearly, taking her seat. The defense attorney approached. "Please state your name and occupation for the record." "Kimberly Daniels. I'm a special agent with the United States Secret Service." A subtle change came over the courtroom. Someone coughed. The prosecutor, who had been writing notes, looked up sharply, and Judge Harmon, who had been half listening while reviewing documents, raised his head with an expression that Kimberly had seen countless times before. Polite disbelief mixed with amusement. The look didn't bother her anymore. She'd seen it during training, on protection details, and in interagency meetings. It was the look of someone who was about to underestimate her, and in her line of work, being underestimated could sometimes be an advantage. What she didn't know, yet, was whether today, in this courtroom, with her friend's future hanging in the balance, that same assumption would help or hurt their case. But as Judge Harmon set down his pen and turned his full attention to her for the first time since she'd entered the courtroom, she prepared herself for what would come next. A brief silence hung in the air after Kimberly stated her occupation. Judge Harmon's expression shifted from mild boredom to something between amusement and disbelief. He leaned forward slightly, removing his glasses and placing them on the bench in front of him. "I'm sorry, did you say United States Secret Service?" he asked, his tone light but unmistakably skeptical. "Yes, Your Honor," Kimberly replied evenly. "I've been with the agency for 7 years. A low chuckle escaped from the judge's throat. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but in the quiet courtroom it carried. A few others joined in. A juror in the back row, someone in the gallery, and most noticeably, the prosecutor, who didn't even try to hide her smirk. Kimberly had expected this. It wasn't the first time, and it probably wouldn't be the last. She kept her expression neutral, her posture straight. In her line of work, staying composed under pressure wasn't just a skill, it was a necessity. "Ms. Daniels," Judge Harmon said, emphasizing the Ms. with unmistakable condescension. "This is a court of law, not a creative writing class. I'll ask you again to state your actual occupation for the record." The defense attorney stood quickly. "Your Honor, Agent Daniels is indeed employed by the United States Secret Service. Her testimony is crucial to establishing my client's whereabouts at the time of the alleged crime." Judge Harmon waved him off. "Counsel, I expect you to properly vet your witnesses. If this is some kind of stunt to lend credibility to your client's alibi, I'm not amused." "It's not a stunt, Your Honor," the attorney insisted, his voice rising, slightly with frustration. "Sit down," Judge Harmon snapped. He turned his attention back to Kimberly, his expression now hardened. "Young lady, making false claims about federal employment is a serious offense. I'll give you one more opportunity to answer truthfully before I hold you in contempt." The prosecutor stood, smoothing her pencil skirt with one hand. "Your Honor, perhaps we should take a brief recess to allow defense counsel to speak with his witness." The suggestion carried a clear implication that Kimberly needed to be coached into telling the truth. Across the courtroom, Michael sat rigid, his eyes darting between Kimberly and the judge. She gave him a small, reassuring nod. "That won't be necessary," Kimberly said, maintaining eye contact with Judge Harmon. "I stated my occupation correctly. I'm a special agent with the United States Secret Service assigned to the Financial Crimes Division out of the Detroit field office." The specific details seemed to give the judge pause, if only momentarily. He studied her face, perhaps looking for signs of deception or nervousness. Finding none, his frown deepened. "Your Honor," the defense attorney tried again, "if I may approach the bench?" Judge Harmon sighed heavily. "Fine. Prosecution too." As the attorneys approached, Kimberly remained seated in the witness box, conscious of the curious stares from the jury and spectators. She'd worn her plainest suit today, her badge and gun locked in her car. It had been a deliberate choice. She wasn't here to intimidate or show authority, just to provide factual testimony for a friend. Now she was second-guessing that decision. At the bench, the young defense attorney was speaking rapidly in hushed tones, occasionally gesturing back toward Kimberly. The prosecutor kept shaking her head, while Judge Harmon listened with narrowed eyes. After a minute or so, he held up his hand to silence them both. "Return to your tables," he ordered. The attorney stepped back, the defense lawyer looking worried, the prosecutor smug. Judge Harmon turned his attention back to Kimberly. "Ms. Daniels, are you prepared to provide proof of your claimed occupation?" "Yes, Your Honor," Kimberly replied, without hesitation. "Please do so." Kimberly glanced at the bailiff, silently asking permission to stand. He nodded, and she rose from the witness box, conscious of every eye in the courtroom following her movements. She reached into her inner jacket pocket and removed her credentials wallet, black leather worn at the edges from years of daily use. She walked forward and handed it to the bailiff, who examined it with widening eyes before passing it to Judge Harmon. The judge opened the wallet, revealing the gold Secret Service badge on one side and her ID card on the other, complete with her photograph, name, and title. For a moment, Judge Harmon said nothing. He stared at the credentials, then at Kimberly, then back at the credentials. The courtroom remained silent, the tension almost palpable. "These appear to be authentic," he finally said, his voice noticeably less confident than before. "They are authentic, Your Honor," Kimberly confirmed. The prosecutor wasn't ready to concede. "Your Honor, while the credentials look official, we have no way to verify their authenticity in this courtroom. Anyone can purchase realistic-looking badges online." Judge Harmon frowned at her. "Are you suggesting that someone would impersonate a federal agent in my courtroom, Ms. Maxwell?" Before the prosecutor could respond, Kimberly spoke. Your Honor, if it would help, you can contact Special Agent in Charge Anthony Richardson at the Detroit field office. His direct number is on the back of my card. He can confirm my identity and position. The specific name and details seemed to finally convince Judge Harmon. He handed the credentials back to the bailiff, who returned them to Kimberly. That won't be necessary, the judge said, clearing his throat. The court accepts your identification, Agent Daniels. Kimberly returned to the witness box, tucking her credentials back into her jacket pocket. She noticed how the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. The jurors sat up straighter, paying closer attention. The smirk had vanished from the prosecutor's face, and Judge Harmon, who had been dismissive and condescending just minutes ago, now regarded her with a new wariness. "Let's proceed," he said, gesturing to the defense attorney. "Counselor, you may continue with your witness." The young lawyer nodded, visibly relieved. "Thank you, Your Honor." He approached the witness stand. "Agent Daniels, how do you know the defendant, Michael Johnson? We grew up as neighbors in Detroit. Our backyard shared a fence. We've been friends for over 20 years. And can you tell the court why your testimony is relevant to this case?" Kimberly nodded. 3 weeks ago, on the night of May 12th, I was reviewing security footage from my apartment building as part of a separate investigation. The cameras cover the main entrance, all stairwells, and the parking garage. While reviewing the footage, I noticed Michael arriving at the building at approximately 9:47 p.m. And why is this significant? The robbery he's accused of committing took place at a convenience store on the other side of town at 9:50 p.m. Even with no traffic, it would take at least 25 minutes to drive between the two locations. The defense attorney nodded. So it would have been physically impossible for the defendant to have committed the robbery. "Yes," Kimberly confirmed, "completely impossible." "Your Honor," the attorney said, turning to face the judge, "we have the security footage from Agent Daniels' apartment building, which clearly shows my client entering at 9:47 p.m. and not leaving until the following morning. With the court's permission, I'd like to play this footage for the jury." Judge Harmon, now all business, nodded. "Proceed." As the attorney set up the video, Kimberly glanced at Michael. He gave her a small, grateful smile. She understood what he was feeling. The relief of having someone believe you, of having evidence that proved your innocence. In her years with the Secret Service, she'd seen how easily the system could overlook people, how quickly assumptions were made based on appearances or backgrounds. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the footage began playing on a screen set up for the jury. The black and white video clearly showed Michael entering the apartment building, nodding to the security guard and checking his watch. The timestamp in the corner read 9:47 p.m., May 12th. "Agent Daniels," the defense attorney asked, "as someone trained in investigation and evidence assessment, would you say this footage has been altered in any way?" "No," she replied confidently. "The footage is continuous and unedited. The timestamps match the backup server logs, which are tamper-proof. This is authentic." The prosecutor stood. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness is not an expert in video analysis." Judge Harmon, who had been watching the footage with intense focus, shook his head. "Actually, as a Secret Service agent, she likely is." Overruled. Kimberly tried not to show her surprise at the judge's sudden support. The same man who had laughed at her credentials minutes ago was now defending her expertise. The defense attorney continued, "Agent Daniels, in your professional opinion, what does this footage tell us about my client's involvement in the robbery?" "It tells us that he couldn't have committed it," Kimberly stated clearly. "It's an ironclad alibi. Michael Johnson was in my apartment building at the exact time the robbery was taking place across town." The prosecutor approached for cross-examination. Her earlier confidence visibly diminished. "Agent Daniels, given your long friendship with the defendant, isn't it possible that your judgment in this matter is biased?" "I'm presenting factual evidence, not judgment," Kimberly replied calmly. "The timestamp on that footage isn't biased. It's simply showing where Michael was at 9:47 p.m. My personal connection to him doesn't change the facts." "But you chose to get involved in this case because of your friendship, correct?" "I came forward because I had evidence proving an innocent man was being wrongfully accused," Kimberly corrected her. "I would have done the same if it had been a stranger. That's Part of my job, ensuring justice is properly served. The prosecutor tried several more angles, questioning the reliability of the timestamp, suggesting the footage might have been from a different day, even implying that Kimberly might have tampered with it. But with each question, Kimberly's responses grew more precise and technical, drawing on her training and experience until even Judge Harmon was nodding along with her explanations. Finally, the prosecutor had no more questions. As Kimberly stepped down from the witness box, she felt Judge Harmon's eyes following her. The man who had laughed at her, who had threatened to hold her in contempt, was now watching her with something that looked remarkably like respect and perhaps a touch of embarrassment. The courtroom took a 15-minute recess after Kimberly's testimony. As people filed out into the hallway, she stayed behind, sitting in the first row of the gallery. Michael's attorney approached her, running a hand through his hair with a relieved smile. "That was incredible," he said, keeping his voice low. "Did you see the judge's face when he looked at your badge? I thought he was going to fall out of his chair." Kimberly allowed herself a small smile. "I'm just glad the evidence is being taken seriously now." "Seriously? The jury couldn't take their eyes off you. Or the judge, for that matter. I don't think I've ever seen Judge Harmon backpedal so quickly." He glanced around and leaned closer. "Between us, he has a reputation for being, let's say, set in his ways, especially with witnesses who don't fit his idea of what an expert should look like." "I'm familiar with the type," Kimberly replied. She'd encountered plenty of Judge Harmons in her career, people who took one look at her and made assumptions about her capabilities, her intelligence, her place. The young lawyer nodded. "Well, you certainly changed the tone in there." The prosecutor looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. "What happens next?" Kimberly asked, nodding toward Michael, who was speaking quietly with a court officer near the defense table. "The prosecution has one more witness, the store clerk who was working during the robbery. Then closing arguments. With your testimony and that footage, I'm feeling good about our chances." "Don't get overconfident," Kimberly warned. "The prosecutor seems like the type who always has a backup plan." As if summoned by their conversation, the prosecutor walked past, pretending not to notice them while clearly listening to every word. She disappeared into a side room with a thick folder tucked under her arm. When court resumed, the atmosphere felt different. Judge Harmon's demeanor had shifted from dismissive to attentive. He listened carefully as the store clerk took the stand, a nervous young man with glasses who kept fidgeting with his tie. "Mr. Chen," the prosecutor began, "you were working at the Quick Stop on Elmwood Avenue on the night of May 12th, correct?" "Yes, ma'am. I was the only one there. Tuesday nights are usually slow. Can you tell the court what happened at approximately 9:50 p.m. that evening?" The clerk described a man entering the store wearing a hoodie and keeping his face turned away from the security camera. He demanded money from the register, implied he had a weapon, and fled with about $300 in cash. "And is the man who robbed you in the courtroom today?" the prosecutor asked, her voice confident. The clerk adjusted his glasses and scanned the room. His eyes settled briefly on Michael before moving on. He frowned, looking again. I'm not sure," he said finally. The prosecutor's expression tightened. "Mr. Chen, you previously identified the defendant in a photo lineup. Has something changed?" "Well, seeing him in person, I don't know. The guy who robbed me was about the same height and build, but..." He shook his head. "It was dark, and he kept his face down. I only saw him for maybe 30 seconds. Judge Harmon leaned forward. "Mr. Chen, you're under oath. Are you saying you cannot positively identify the defendant as the person who robbed your store?" The clerk swallowed hard. "Yes, Your Honor. I can't be completely sure." The prosecutor tried to recover, showing surveillance footage from the store. The image was grainy and showed only a figure in dark clothing whose face was never clearly visible. "Mr. Chen, based on the build, height, and clothing of this individual, is this consistent with your memory of the robber?" "Yes, but..." The clerk hesitated. "There's nothing specific that would make me certain it's him." He gestured toward Michael. During cross-examination, the defense attorney kept his questions simple. "Mr. Chen, what was the robber wearing?" "A dark hoodie, jeans, and sneakers." Pretty common clothing, wouldn't you say? Yes, sir. And you never clearly saw his face? No, sir. So your identification was based primarily on general build and height? Yes, sir. And now, seeing my client in person, you're no longer confident in that identification? The clerk sighed. That's correct. When the witness was excused, Kimberly could feel the case shifting. The prosecutor's key witness had just undermined her entire case. Combined with the security footage showing Michael across town, reasonable doubt wasn't just present, it was overwhelming. The prosecutor requested a brief sidebar with the judge. After a hushed conversation, Judge Harmon turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a 30-minute recess. Please do not discuss the case among yourselves. As the jurors filed out, Kimberly caught the prosecutor making a phone call. Her expression tense. Something was happening. When court resumed, the prosecutor stood. Your Honor, in light of new evidence presented today, the state requests a dismissal of all charges against Michael Johnson. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Michael's attorney looked shocked, then quickly composed himself. The defense has no objection, Your Honor. Judge Harmon nodded. Very well, in the case of State v. Johnson, all charges are hereby dismissed. He turned to Michael. Mr. Johnson, you are free to go. The court apologizes for any inconvenience. Any inconvenience. As if being wrongfully accused, arrested, and nearly convicted was comparable to a delayed flight or a reservation mix-up. Kimberly watched as Michael closed his eyes briefly, his shoulders dropping with relief. Court is adjourned, Judge Harmon announced, bringing down his gavel. People began gathering their things, the buzz of conversation filling the room. Michael hugged his attorney, then made his way to Kimberly. I don't even know how to thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You don't need to, she replied simply. It's what friends do. As the courtroom emptied, Kimberly noticed Judge Harmon watching them from the bench. He hadn't yet retired to his chambers, seemingly hesitating. After a moment, he stepped down and approached. Agent Daniels, he said, his tone formal but lacking the condescension from earlier. Might I have a word? Michael squeezed her arm and moved away, giving them privacy. Your Honor, Kimberly said, maintaining her professional demeanor. The judge cleared his throat. I want to acknowledge what happened earlier. My behavior was inappropriate. Kimberly said nothing, waiting. After 7 years in law enforcement, she'd learned the power of silence, how it often revealed more than words ever could. I made assumptions that were unfounded, Judge Harmon continued, clearly uncomfortable with her silence. And in doing so, I nearly obstructed justice in my own courtroom. The important thing is that the right outcome was reached, Kimberly said finally. Michael is innocent. The evidence proved that. Evidence I might have dismissed if you hadn't been so persistent, the judge admitted. That security footage would have carried far less weight if presented by someone without your credentials. And there it was, the uncomfortable truth at the heart of the matter. How often did evidence get overlooked, testimonies dismissed, or cases mishandled because of who presented them rather than their merit? How many people without a Secret Service badge to fall back on had stood where she stood and not been believed? I hope this experience will be informative in future cases, Your Honor, Kimberly said carefully. Judge Harmon nodded, understanding the gentle rebuke. It already has been, Agent Daniels, more than you know. He hesitated, then extended his hand. Thank you for your service, both to your country and to this court today. Kimberly shook his hand, noting the firmness of his grip and the direct eye contact he now maintained. It was a small thing, perhaps, but significant. As Judge Harmon walked away, the prosecutor approached, her earlier confidence replaced with a grudging respect. That was quite a performance, Agent Daniels, she said. Not many witnesses stand their ground in this courtroom the way you did. It wasn't a performance, Kimberly replied. Just the truth. The prosecutor nodded. For what it's worth. I made the call to dismiss as soon as I verified your credentials and reviewed that footage more carefully. I'm not in the business of prosecuting innocent people. I'm glad to hear it. Though I have to ask, why didn't you come forward with this evidence sooner? It could have prevented the trial altogether. Kimberly sighed. I only found the footage last week during a routine review. I immediately notified Michael's attorney, but he told me the prosecutor's office, your office, wouldn't meet with him to review new evidence. The prosecutor had the grace to look embarrassed. That shouldn't have happened. I'll look into it. After the prosecutor left, Kimberly joined Michael and his lawyer in the hallway. Other cases were being called. Other lives hanging in the balance in other courtrooms. The machinery of justice grinding on. Imperfect, but necessary. The prosecutor seemed genuinely surprised when I told her about trying to submit the evidence. Earlier, Kimberly said to the attorney. He nodded. Someone in her office kept blocking me. I couldn't get past the front desk. That's why we had to present it during trial. It was the only way to make sure it was seen. Michael shook his head. I still can't believe it's over. 3 months of my life on hold for something I didn't do. What will you do now? Kimberly asked. Go back to work, I hope. Try to rebuild. He smiled suddenly. And maybe buy a better security system for my apartment. Apparently they come in handy. As they walked toward the exit, a young woman approached them, notepad in hand. Excuse me, she said. I'm Lisa Wong from the City Tribune. I was in court covering another case when I saw what happened. Would any of you be willing to comment on today's proceedings? Michael and his attorney exchanged glances, unsure. But Kimberly saw an opportunity, not just for Michael, but for others who might face similar situations. Actually, she said, I think this is a story worth telling. A week after the trial, Kimberly sat at her kitchen table, coffee in hand, staring at the newspaper spread out before her. The headline read, Secret Service Agent Exposes Flaws in Justice System, Saves Innocent Man. Below it was a photo of her standing on the courthouse steps beside Michael, both of them squinting slightly in the sunlight. The reporter, Lisa Wong, had done a thorough job. The article detailed not just Michael's case, but placed it in the context of a broader pattern. How easily evidence could be overlooked, how quickly assumptions could be made, and how the system sometimes needed to be shocked into seeing its own blind spots. Her phone buzzed with a text from Michael. Have you seen it? Page 3 has quotes from 2 other cases where Judge Harmon dismissed evidence from non-credible witnesses. This is bigger than just me. Kimberly texted back. I saw. How are you holding up with all the attention? Better than expected. Got my job back with an apology from the company. Boss read the article. She smiled at that small victory. Michael had worked at the same shipping warehouse for 4 years, building a reputation as a reliable employee until his arrest had put everything on hold. It was good to see at least one piece of his life returning to normal. Her own life, however, had gotten more complicated. Her supervisor had called her in for a meeting the day after the article was published. She'd expected a reprimand for involving herself in a local case without prior approval, maybe even a note in her file. Instead, Anthony Richardson, the special agent in charge of the Detroit field office, had surprised her. Not exactly low-profile, Daniels, he'd said, tossing the newspaper onto his desk. No, sir, she'd agreed. I apologize for any unwanted attention on the agency. Richardson had studied her for a long moment. You know, when I took this job, my mentor told me something I've never forgotten. He said, the badge isn't just about what we protect, it's about what we stand for. Sometimes that means currency and dignitaries. Sometimes it means the truth. He'd leaned back in his chair. The director called this morning. Kimberly had felt her stomach drop. The director of the United States Secret Service had called about her case. Apparently someone in the Justice Department flagged the article. They're launching a review of similar cases where evidence may have been improperly dismissed based on, let's call them, credibility assumptions. I didn't intend to cause, she'd started. Richardson had held up a hand. You did exactly what we're trained to do, Daniels. You observed, you evaluated evidence, and you acted to protect the integrity of the system. The director wants you to consult with the review team. They could use someone with your perspective. Now, sipping her coffee and reading through the article again, Kimberly wondered what that consultation would involve. She'd joined the Secret Service to protect, primarily currency from counterfeiters and occasionally public officials. She'd never imagined becoming an advocate for systemic change. Her doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. Through the peephole, she saw Michael's attorney looking more put together than he had during the trial, his suit pressed and his hair neatly combed. "Agent Daniels," he said when she opened the door. "Sorry to drop by unannounced. I tried calling your office, but they said you were off today." "Just Kimberly is fine when we're not in court," she said, inviting him in. "What can I do for you?" The young lawyer looked both excited and nervous as he took a seat at her kitchen table. "I've been contacted by the State Bar Association. They're putting together a training program on witness evaluation and evidence assessment. They want me to speak about Michael's case, and they're hoping you might be willing to participate as well." Kimberly raised an eyebrow. "Me? I'm not a lawyer." "Exactly," he said with unexpected enthusiasm. "That's what makes your perspective so valuable. You're trained to evaluate evidence differently than we are. You look at reliability and authenticity, not just admissibility. Plus your experience in that courtroom." He gestured toward the newspaper. "It puts a human face on a problem many people in the system don't want to acknowledge." She thought about it, remembering Judge Harmon's face when he'd realized his mistake. "When would this be?" "They're organizing a series of workshops starting next month. The first one would be for judges and senior prosecutors." He smiled slightly. "Including Judge Harmon." "He agreed to attend?" The lawyer nodded. "Apparently our case made quite an impression on him. He's been reflecting on his approach to witness testimony." Kimberly thought about the irony. How her badge had forced the judge to see her, really see her, when minutes before he'd been ready to dismiss her entirely. And now she was being asked to help others avoid making the same mistake. "I'll need to clear it with my supervisor," she said. Finally, but tentatively, yes. After the lawyer left, Kimberly called Michael to tell him about the Bar Association request. "You should do it," he said immediately. "Your story needs to be heard." "It's not just my story," she reminded him. "It's yours too." "Then maybe I should be there as well," Michael suggested. "The person they almost convicted based on a vague description in a hoodie." She smiled at his determination. The Michael she'd known growing up had been quieter, less willing to step into the spotlight. But the trial had changed him, not broken him as it might have, but awakened something. "I'll mention it to the attorney," she promised. Later that afternoon, Kimberly drove to her parents' house for their weekly Sunday dinner. As she pulled into the driveway of the modest two-story home where she'd grown up, she noticed extra cars parked along the street. Inside, she found not just her parents but also her aunt, 2 cousins, and several family friends. They erupted in cheers when she walked in. "There she is," her father called proudly, holding up the newspaper. "Our daughter, the hero." "Dad," she protested, embarrassed but secretly pleased. "I was just doing what anyone would do. But that's just it, baby," her mother said, pulling her into a tight hug. "Not anyone would have done what you did. Not anyone could have." Her father nodded seriously. "Your mother's right. Most people see an injustice and shake their heads. Maybe they complain about it later to friends, but you stood up and made them listen." As the impromptu celebration continued around her, Kimberly found herself thinking about her journey to this moment. How many times had she been underestimated? How many rooms had she walked into where people assumed she didn't belong? The academy, her first field office, protection details where people mistook her for administrative staff rather than an agent. Each time she'd had to prove herself, to show her badge figuratively and sometimes literally. It was exhausting, that constant need to establish credibility, but it had also made her more observant, more aware of others who might be overlooked or dismissed. Maybe that's why she'd noticed Michael on that security footage when reviewing an unrelated case. Maybe that's why she'd been so insistent on being heard in that courtroom. Her phone buzzed with a text from her supervisor. "Director approved your participation in the Bar Association training. Says to tell you good work, Agent Daniels." High praise from him. She smiled and tucked the phone away, rejoining the celebration. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, a financial fraud case she'd been working on for months, preparation for the Bar Association workshops, the Justice Department consultation, but tonight was for family, for reflection, and for the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes justice needed more than just a system. Sometimes it needed people willing to stand up when others were ready to sit down. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, her aunt pulled her aside. "I saw you on the news," she said quietly. "Reminded me of something your grandfather used to say before he passed. He'd tell us, 'Don't just wear the uniform, honor it.' He'd be so proud of you, Kimberly." The mention of her grandfather, a man who had served as one of the first black police officers in their district during the 1960s, brought unexpected tears to her eyes. How many indignities had he endured? How many times had he been dismissed or overlooked? Yet he had persisted, creating a path that eventually made her own career possible. "Thanks, Auntie," she whispered, hugging the older woman. Her father approached as her aunt moved away. "Everything okay?" Kimberly nodded. "Just thinking about Grandpa, about legacy." Her father smiled knowingly. "He always said you had his spirit. Stubborn as a mule when you know you're right." He chuckled. "Guess that Judge Harmon found that out the hard way." "I wasn't trying to embarrass him," Kimberly said. "I just wanted Michael to get a fair hearing. Sometimes fairness looks like embarrassment to people who aren't used to being challenged," her father replied, surprising her with his insight. "Your grandfather knew that too." As the house finally quieted and she helped her parents clean up, Kimberly found herself wondering what would happen next. The newspaper article had struck a chord, generating discussions about witness credibility and implicit bias in courtrooms across the state. The Justice Department review could potentially impact cases nationwide, all because she'd insisted on being heard in one courtroom, on one day. Her mother seemed to read her thoughts. "You've started something important," she said, drying a plate Kimberly had just washed. "But don't carry the weight of the whole system on your shoulders. Change happens step by step, voice by voice." Kimberly nodded, thinking about the Bar Association workshops, about Michael's willingness to share his story, about Judge Harmon's unexpected openness to reflection. One courtroom at a time, she agreed. Her phone buzzed again. An email notification from Lisa Wong, the reporter. The subject line read, "Follow-up story opportunity?" The preview showed the first line, "Your case has inspired others to come forward." Kimberly dried her hands, feeling a mixture of determination and hope. There would be time to read that email later, to consider what came next. For now, she was exactly where she needed to be, remembering where she came from and why the badge she carried mattered so much. Not just for what it represented, but for who she was when she wore it. 3 months after the trial, Kimberly stood at the back of a large conference room in the downtown courthouse complex. The room was filled with judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys, all gathered for the Bar Association's training session on witness evaluation and evidence assessment. It was the third such session she'd participated in, but this one felt different, more significant somehow. Maybe it was because Judge Harmon was sitting in the front row, occasionally jotting notes as the speakers presented their materials. Or maybe it was because Michael was scheduled to speak today for the first time, sharing his perspective as someone who had nearly been convicted despite clear evidence of his innocence. "You ready for this?" Michael asked, appearing at her side. He looked different now, more confident in his new charcoal suit, his posture straighter than she remembered from before the trial. "I should be asking you that," she replied. "You're the one telling your story today." He shrugged. "After everything that's happened, talking to a room full of lawyers doesn't seem so scary anymore." The moderator, a distinguished law professor from the state university, approached them with a smile. "Agent Daniels, Mr. Johnson, we're ready. For your segment whenever you are." As they made their way to the front of the room, Kimberly caught Judge Harmon's eye. He nodded slightly, an acknowledgement that might have gone unnoticed by others but spoke volumes to her. He had been surprisingly supportive of these training sessions, even volunteering to share his own perspective on how bias could affect judicial decisions. "Our next speakers need little introduction. the moderator began. Their case has become a cornerstone of our discussions on evidence evaluation and witness credibility. Please welcome Special Agent Kimberly Daniels of the United States Secret Service and Mr. Michael Johnson. The applause was polite but genuine. These weren't people looking for entertainment. They were professionals seeking to improve a system they worked within every day. Michael spoke first, his voice steady as he described the experience of being wrongfully accused, of having his life put on hold, of facing a system that seemed more interested in closing a case than finding the truth. The scariest part wasn't being arrested, he said. It was realizing how easily I could have been convicted despite being innocent. If my friend hadn't happened to spot me on that security footage, I might be sitting in prison right now instead of standing here talking to you. When Kimberly's turn came, she focused not on Judge Harmon's initial dismissal of her, but on the systemic issues it represented. Credibility shouldn't depend on a badge, she said. The evidence I presented was exactly the same evidence whether I was a federal agent or not. The timestamp on that footage didn't change based on who showed it to you, but the weight it was given did. She paused, looking around the room. Every day in courtrooms across this country, people without badges or titles or credentials try to be heard. Their evidence is no less valid, their observations no less accurate, but their voices are often given less weight. That's not just unfair to them, it's dangerous to the integrity of the entire system. During the Q&A session that followed, a young prosecutor raised her hand. Agent Daniels, what would you suggest we do differently in our daily practice to avoid these kinds of biases? Kimberly considered the question. Start by questioning your own assumptions. When you find yourself dismissing a witness or a piece of evidence, ask yourself why. Is it based on the actual reliability of the information, or is it based on who's presenting it? The truth doesn't care about the messenger. After the session ended, several attendees approached them to continue the conversation. Kimberly noticed Judge Harmon hanging back, waiting until the crowd thinned before making his way over. Agent Daniels, Mr. Johnson, he greeted them formally. That was illuminating. Thank you, Your Honor, Michael replied. There was no bitterness in his voice, just a calm dignity that Kimberly admired. The judge hesitated, then continued. I've been on the bench for 30 years. That's a long time to develop habits, some good, some not so good. What happened in my courtroom that day has forced me to re-examine a lot of those habits. He turned specifically to Kimberly. Your point about the evidence being the same regardless of who presents it, that stayed with me. I've started asking myself a question before ruling on testimony. Would I accept this if it came from a different source? It's been eye-opening. That's a good start, Kimberly acknowledged. Self-awareness is always the first step. Judge Harmon nodded, then surprised them both by extending his hand to Michael. Mr. Johnson, I want to personally apologize for what you experienced in my courtroom. The system failed you, and as part of that system, so did I. Michael shook his hand firmly. I appreciate that, Your Honor. But I'm more interested in what happens next. Not just for me, but for everyone else who might find themselves where I was. As it happens, the judge replied, I've been appointed to a committee reviewing judicial training practices statewide. Your case is already being used as a case study. It's having an impact. After Judge Harmon moved away, Lisa Wong, the reporter, who had broken the original story, approached them with a digital recorder in hand. Mind if I get a few quotes about today's session, she asked. The follow-up story I wrote last month got picked up by national outlets. People are paying attention to this. Kimberly hadn't expected the case to gain such traction. What had started as one friend helping another had somehow sparked conversations about bias and evidence evaluation across the legal community. The Justice Department review was ongoing, looking at similar cases where potentially reliable evidence might have been dismissed based on who presented it rather than its merit. What do you think about the changes being proposed? Lisa asked, nodding toward a group of judges and attorneys still deep in discussion across the room. It's a start, Kimberly said carefully. Real change takes time and commitment, but at least people are talking about the right issues now. Later that evening, Kimberly and Michael had dinner at a small restaurant near the courthouse. They were joined by his sister Beth, who had flown in from Chicago to support him during his presentation. "I still can't believe my little brother is out here changing the justice system," Beth teased, bumping his shoulder affectionately. Michael laughed. "I just told my story. Kim's the one who made them listen." "We both played our parts," Kimberly corrected him. "And so did a lot of other people, your lawyer, Lisa Wong, even Judge Harmon in his own way." Beth raised her glass. "Well, here's to all of you then, and to security cameras with accurate timestamps." They clinked glasses, the moment light despite the serious journey that had brought them there. "So what's next for you?" Kimberly asked Michael. "Still thinking about that community college program?" He nodded. "Registered for classes starting next month, criminal justice major." He smiled at her surprised expression. "What? Somebody's got to help fix this system from the inside. Might as well be someone who's seen its flaws up close." "I think that's perfect," she said, genuinely impressed by his resilience. Where another person might have become bitter or withdrawn after such an experience, Michael had found purpose. "What about you?" Beth asked Kimberly. "I heard rumors that the Justice Department was trying to recruit you for some special task force." Kimberly raised an eyebrow at Michael, who held up his hands innocently. "Don't look at me. News travels. It's still just preliminary discussions," Kimberly admitted. "They're forming a working group to examine evidence evaluation protocols across different jurisdictions. They want someone with both federal experience and, well, personal perspective on the issue." "You should do it," Michael said immediately. "You could make a real difference." "Maybe," she said, "but I'd have to take a temporary leave from field work. I'm not sure I'm ready for that." The truth was, Kimberly loved her job with the Secret Service. She'd worked hard to get where she was, to earn the respect of her colleagues, to become good at what she did. The idea of stepping away, even temporarily, was difficult to consider. Yet the conversations she'd been part of over the past 3 months had awakened something in her, a recognition that her experience and voice could contribute to meaningful change. It wasn't a path she'd ever envisioned for herself. But then, again, neither was becoming the focus of a news story or speaking at Bar Association training sessions. "Whatever you decide," Michael said, seeming to read her thoughts. "You've already changed things. You changed my life, that's for sure." "We changed each other's," Kimberly replied. "That day in court, it wasn't just about your case anymore. It became about something bigger." As the evening wound down and they prepared to leave, Kimberly's phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from her supervisor, forwarding a message from the director's office. The subject line read, "Congressional Testimony Request." She stared at it for a moment, then put her phone away. That was tomorrow's challenge. Tonight was for celebrating how far they'd already come, from a moment of disbelief and laughter in a courtroom to a movement for change that was gaining momentum across the country. Outside the restaurant, as they said their goodbyes, Michael pulled Kimberly into a quick hug. "You know what I keep thinking about?" he asked. "That look on Judge Harmon's face when you showed him your badge. Like his whole worldview got flipped upside down in 1 second. Kimberly smiled. "Sometimes that's what it takes. One moment that makes you question everything you thought you knew." "Well, here's to many more such moments," Beth said, linking arms with her brother. "For judges, prosecutors, and anyone else who needs their worldview flipped." As Kimberly walked to her car, she thought about the journey that had started with a simple act, standing up in a courtroom and insisting on being heard. She hadn't set out to change the system or become an advocate. She'd just been doing what she believed was right, using the tools and training she had to help a friend. But sometimes that's how change begins. Not with grand plans or sweeping gestures, but with one person refusing to be dismissed, one piece of evidence being properly seen, one judge willing to recognize his mistake. The congressional testimony request would wait until morning. The Justice Department working group would continue its review. The training sessions would reach more judges and attorneys, and somewhere, in courtrooms she might never see, witnesses would be heard who might otherwise have been dismissed. Evidence would be evaluated on its merits rather than its messenger, and the system would inch closer to the justice it promised. All because a judge had laughed at a black woman in court, and then frozen when she showed her badge.